Hi everybody, welcome to Chapter 2 and the Challenge of Democracy. This chapter will be looking at majoritarian and pluralist democracy and understand the differences in the different types of democracy. These are the 5 learning outcomes for this chapter. So basically the entire chapter will be spent on helping you to understand these 5 concepts in preparation for your exam for Chapter 2. Now, the basic premise in any discussion of democracy is understanding where democracy comes from and the idea behind it. Now, ancient Greek philosophies identified government types based on the number of citizens involved in the process. So if you can imagine a straight line on a chalkboard or on a whiteboard, on one side, one end of the line you have one person, and on the other end of the line you have everybody. The Greeks believed that all types of governments could fall somewhere in this range. So for instance, in an autocracy you have power in the hands of a single individual. Monarch, emperor, something along these lines. In an oligarchy you have a system of government in which the few people have power. This may be a little bit harder to understand, but if you think about the French government right before, right at the end, probably 1780s, early 1790s, when Napoleon first rose to power, there was 3 there. If you think about the old Roman government, the triumvirate, then that's also an oligarchy. You could also point to some governments in history that were in the power of church leaders. Those would be oligarchies as well. And then, of course, you have democracy, which is a system of government which, in theory at least, people rule. It could either be a direct democracy in which everybody votes, or an indirect democracy in which a few people vote for everyone, such as what we have in this country. Now, it's hard to imagine people being afraid of democracy, but the ancient Greeks actually were afraid of democracy. They were afraid of a government in which the rank and file citizens vote. And to understand the fear, you have to understand the term demagogue. Demos means common power. Kratos, or Gog, demos means common people. Kratos, or Gog, means power. And so when you think about it, a demagogue, it's an individual that's able to control people through fear by manipulating their emotions and their prejudices. Ancient Greeks were afraid that people would be able to manipulate individuals to get them to vote the way that they wanted them to. And therefore, by allowing everyone to vote, it was much easier for people to control power. And even in the earliest stages of our country's founding, there were some who thought a democracy was not the best way to go because they were afraid that uneducated individuals could be swayed to vote one way or another. Now, there are 2 major schools of thought about what constitutes a democracy. Some will say that democracy is a form of government in which you emphasize procedures, such as meeting to discuss issues, voting in elections, running for public offices, so those types of procedures. The second is a substance of government policies that make up democracy, such as freedom of religion, provision for basic human needs. So what a government actually does more so than how they do it. Procedural approach focuses on how decisions are made. The substantive approach focuses on what the government then actually does. And so when you think about a procedural view of democracy, you're looking at 3 basic things. You're looking at universal participation. Everyone should be involved in the decision-making process. And everyone's vote then should count equally, or political equality. And that majority rule. That is, the decision of the group must reflect at least half of of the individual's preferences. Now think about that for a second. Over half a group of people vote for an idea. Does it always make it the best idea for everyone? Which is something we'll talk about in a little bit. But again, these are all basic pieces of a procedural view of democracy, process, how things happen, how things occur. But there is a complication. Indirect versus indirect democracy. In a direct democracy or participatory democracy, again, rank and file citizens rule themselves. They don't elect people to govern on their behalf. And you can see things like this with e-government, in which different cities, in this case Boston, have allowed citizens to easily obtain information about the government and also express their opinion to government officials very easily, much more so than writing a letter or an email. But in a representative democracy or an indirect democracy, we elect people to vote for us and hope that they make the best decisions for us. Now, in this case, in a representative government, you are hoping that the people you elect are what's called responsive, or that they have responsiveness. And that is, they should do what the majority of the people want them to do. And that's part of that trust in a representative democracy, is trusting others to vote in what is your best interest. So, in a procedural democracy, there are four basic principles: universal participation, political equality, majority rule, and then that government responsiveness to public opinion. But in a substantive view of democracy, again, we're not focusing on procedures, we're focusing on substance. That is, what makes up a government policy rather than how the policy is made. And theorists disagree most sharply on whether a government must promote social equality to qualify as a democracy. As an example, must a state guarantee unemployment benefits and adequate public housing to be called democratic? Some insist that policies that promote social equality are essential to democratic government. Others restrict the requirements of substantive democracy to policies that safeguard civil liberties and civil rights. So for conservatives, they have a much narrower view of what makes a democracy substantive, whereas liberals have a much broader view on what makes a government substantive. Again, substantive is what makes up the democracy, what makes up the government, not so much the policies that are followed or the procedures that are followed to get there. So take, for example, healthcare. Is it a right in a democracy like ours? Interestingly, people's opinions have changed over time. And if you look at right before the Affordable Care Act was passed, you can see that a lot of people did not think it was the government's responsibility. Now, interestingly enough, after it was passed, the percentage of people who thought it was the government's responsibility went back up. So it's not clear whether the increase in support in 2005 is just a short-term 2015, it's just a short-term fluctuation or reflects the increase in acceptance of the Affordable Care Act. That is, are people more willing to accept government responsibility for health care now that it is part of the law? And of course, we've seen over the last year that debate continues to rage about exactly what government's role is in health care. So in a substantive democracy, there are no clear, precise criteria. But in a procedural democracy, you can have undesirable social policies, but you can also have a system set up where it clashes with minority rights. And so are you choosing procedure or policy? And so you have to be able to balance minority and majority rights. And minority rights are simply things that cannot be denied to any citizen by majority decisions. And a lot of times we think minorities based on some low-hanging fruit, as I would call it: skin color, gender, nationality, sexual orientation. But there are other minorities as well that we need to consider, such as veterans, disabled children. You can't just consider minority based on something that's easy. Again, you have to consider all groups, small in number then, as those who might be a minority. And so in a procedural democracy, sometimes minority rights can be easily overlooked because you have followed the procedure in place. And so we can summarize the theoretical positions by using two alternative models of democracy. Now, as a model, each is a hypothetical plan, a blueprint to achieve a democratic government. So you have the majoritarian model, which values participation, and you have the plural by people, and the pluralist model, which values participation by the people in groups, not so much by individuals. And so, in any democracy, you're going to have elections, you're going to have political parties, legislatures, and interest groups. So what does that look like? Well, in majoritarian model democracy, it is the classic theory of democracy, in which the government by the people is interpreted as government by the majority of the people. That is, a democracy is what is best for the majority, but it may not be for everybody. Usually think of elections only as mechanism for choosing among candidates for public office. Majoritarian theorists also see them as a means for deciding government policies. So you have things like referendums, initiatives, and recalls. Referendums allow state legislatures to place on the ballot questions that allow citizens to vote for it. Initiatives allow citizens to actually circulate petitions to gather enough signatures to put a question on the ballot to be voted on. 24 states allow referendums and 24 states allow initiatives, and they're basically the same state. So when you think about a direct democracy, a lot of times it's really easy to think about it in smaller terms, such as a town hall meeting. And so here's an example. For almost 700 years, you've seen this picture here. Citizens of Ponsel Innerrhodes, which is a small town in Switzerland, have gathered in the town square on last Sunday in April to make political decisions by raising their hands. At a recent meeting, the citizens adopted a leash law for dogs, approved updating property files on a computer, chose a new building commissioner, and acted on other public business before adjourning until the next year. This is the best example of a direct democracy. This is also then a majoritarian democracy because it's by majority rule. But there is an alternative model, what's called a pluralist democracy. And this is a model of democracy in which the government by the people is taken to mean government by people operating through competing interests. So working things out, working together to make the best decision for everybody involved. And I'll pick up here in the next video.